The RFNG is supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. When the oppression of rights is integrated into the governing laws of a country, then we must pressure the courts to change policy. Hello, and welcome to Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Center for First Nations Governance and the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. This episode, we're doing something a little different. We've invited Catherine MacQuarrie and Frances Abele to speak on a panel alongside Kent McNeil about how governments can not only change policy regarding Aboriginal rights, but also how nations can create policy for themselves. Indigenous peoples across Canada have a long history of bringing to the courts, governments, and the public their dissatisfaction with the Crown's failure to recognize their inherent rights. Actions that have changed Canada's policy landscape for the better, but there's still work to be done. My name is Dwayne, Nashkawa, and I will be your host for today. I am Debendogzid, a citizen of the Chippewas-Asawagin First Nation in southwestern Ontario, and have worked in First Nations my whole career. Now I am the Governance Development Director at McNeil. We help support and guide Anishinaabe First Nations who are implementing their self-government agreement with Canada. We also oversee the proper implementation of the Anishinaabe Nation Governance Agreement Act. My collaboration with the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project started with my role as the co-leader of the numbered and pre-Confederation treaties. Our guests today have all made waves in the field of Aboriginal rights and Indigenous policy. Kent McNeil is a retired Distinguished Research Professor at Osgoode Hall Law School. His research has focused on Indigenous people's rights from the far north in Canada and the US to all the way down under in Australia and New Zealand. The Supreme Court of Canada has relied on his work to make important decisions on Indigenous land rights. And welcome back to Catherine MacQuarrie and Dr. Frances Abele, our host and guest from episode 1 on the Indian Act. Catherine has 23 years of expertise in public policy and self-government. She has pursued a lifelong ambition to help First Nations across Canada to advance these areas through her dedicated research. Frances is the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. Her research covers Aboriginal state relations, Aboriginal economic development, Northern political economy, and community development and training. She is also the co-director, along with Satsan, of the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. Ani Kenoya, it's really great to get the opportunity to learn from each of you today.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
In the article, How Indigenous Nations Have Been Transforming Public Policy Through the Courts, it mentions that although many Canadian courts recognize Indigenous law's existence, they are unaware of how to implement it into Canada's common law, civil law, and statute law. So we have a question for Kent, Frances, and Catherine, and that is, why is it important that First Nations fill in the space and stand up for their inherent right to governance? And Kent, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dwayne, and hello, everyone. I really appreciate being invited to be on this panel. So I think it's important because if First Nations don't stand up for their inherent right of first government, that the federal and provincial laws will continue to apply to them. So it's up to First Nations to avoid a legal vacuum by occupying the space with their own laws, because both the courts and other governments abhor legal vacuums. So if First Nations don't have their own laws that fill the space in relation to their areas of jurisdiction, then federal and provincial laws are going to apply by default. And Section 35 of the 1982 Constitution should protect this space for Indigenous governance and laws.
Thank you, Kent. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, Frances.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I
I can't help thinking, too, that the process of writing laws, of deciding what should be in the law, is an important step for any First Nation that's working its way out of the Indian Act and towards Section 35 government. There has to be a discussion about what kind of a society they want and how those laws should be implemented and then acted upon. And it seems to me that that's a really important part of building a new society.
And Catherine, would you care to weigh in?
Ken's absolutely right in terms of First Nations are not creating their own laws and policies. They will leave the space for Crown governments to remain in control. But, it's not just a matter of drafting the laws so they apply. It's really about the fact that up until now, Crown government policy and lawmaking has had some really bad outcomes for First Nations, and particularly on reserves. So it's about taking up space with laws and policies that set your own direction, guide your own actions and decision-making in ways that really work for your nation and your people. And it is it's the core role of any government is actually to make law and policy for their citizens and their nation. So Cornell talks about this as being, and I should probably mention, Stephen Cornell, Native Nations Institute in Arizona, part of groundbreaking studies into effective Indigenous governance. He talks about the importance of doing this to shift from asking other governments what you can do to really rebuilding your own capacity for your own actions. So it's moving from asserting rights to actually exercising them.
Thank you. Francis, I have another question for you along these lines. We're talking about filling in the space and standing up for these inherent rights to governance. What do you think holds some nations back from asserting these inherent rights today?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it has something to do with 8 generations of living under the Indian Act, which is a racist, punitive piece of legislation, but it's also grotesquely out of date. And the kind of government that the Indian Act legislates or creates is an unhealthy one. It misses a lot of the important features of what we would all want in a government, and it entrenches all the power in the hands of the executive branch of the federal government, the federal bureaucracy. So it's difficult, if you've been living under that system for 8 generations, to envision all of a sudden what the future could look like in a better, healthier society. And that is something that a lot of nations are working on now, and it's not surprising that it will take some time because people have to identify the pathology that they want to get rid of, and then envision what a better future would be like.
Yeah, and as a longtime administrator in First Nations, I've seen and felt how the Indian Act can actually sort of condition us to think a certain way, and we have to actively think in our own way to sort of break out of that box. So, I thank you for those insights.
Dwayne, I'd say, too, that the Indian Act is enforced by the control over funding that the federal bureaucracy has. So it's not really optional. Nations have to comply with the Indian Act as long as they are accepting the funding. And so that it's a powerful, even if you can see what's wrong, it's very hard to break away because of the ties that come with the funding. So I think the move towards Section 35 government has to be accompanied by a new financial regime, again, gradually developed, but solid, so that there is the freedom to change what needs to be changed.
Oh, I agree with that 100%. There are so many constraints on those people working in the First Nations, delivering the administrative programs and services, and writing their own laws and policies. It's quite a challenge to push your way out of that box. Catherine, Francis touched on the bureaucracy and the role they play in reinforcing some of these constraints. I'm wondering if you see a role for public servants or non-Indigenous allies in supporting this process, or do you see it as a purely Indigenous space?
I guess, very simply in terms of a role for the public service, it's get out of the way. And I think particularly for those current governments that have taken a policy position of recognizing the inherent right of First Nations to exercise their own jurisdiction. So, critically, really what they need to be doing is examining how their own policies and processes and funding agreements, ways of doing things, ways of interacting with First Nations is actually continuing to create obstacles to self-government. Francis talked about the fiscal issues. I mean, that's a really obvious one. I think, having been a public servant for many years and having worked as well in those departments, I know that most of the people working there have good faith and are there because they do want to see things get better. But they don't really spend a lot of time thinking about how the practices and the policies that they're putting in place are actually continuing to reinforce some of the old sort of colonial mindsets. So it does take a lot of examination, and a good example simply is around the funding agreements and fiscal relationships. Is how could we be doing this better and more effectively and efficiently so that First Nations are in the driver's seat in terms of establishing what the policy priorities are against which they will conduct their spending, and then making sure that they're properly resourced to do that, as any other government in Canada is.
Thank you for that. And we've talked a little bit now about the bureaucracy and the role there and the policymakers. But Kent, I'm wondering how you have seen the courts respond when Indigenous nations assert their laws and advance these legal arguments.
Yeah, it's very mixed when it comes to the judges acknowledging and applying Indigenous law. Some judges are quite open to that, and others just, I think, don't know what to do, right? They're out of their depth. They don't understand Indigenous law. They don't know how to integrate it with federal and provincial laws. So they tend to say, well, we're not able to apply this law because it's not part of Canadian law. But some other judges take a very different position, as they should, because Indigenous law and Indigenous governance, in my opinion, are part of Section 35 rights, and they're protected by the Constitution. So judges need to be taking account of Indigenous laws and applying them in appropriate circumstances. Part of the problem, though, is that Canadian judges don't know Indigenous law, right? Canadian law, they know, they've learned it in law school. They can go to the law library. They can't find Indigenous law in the law library. It has to come from Indigenous people themselves, from the elders, from the knowledge keepers, and so on. So it's a more complex process. And again, some judges just aren't very comfortable with that. So we hear the Supreme Court, for example, saying, yes, Indigenous law, we have to take account of that and so on. But all too often, it just sounds like lip service. You don't really see them doing it. They'll talk about it, but it doesn't get implemented in the way that it really should. So the courts have a ways to go on this. Judges have a way to go. And part of this is a question of legal education. I think as younger people move up through the system, lawyers become judges who've been more exposed to these issues. Things are going to change, but it's going to take time.
Dwayne, can I ask Kent a question, though? But just on that, Kent, I mean, even though, and I agree, courts don't really know what to do with Indigenous law, is the principle that Indigenous law in general prevails when there's an Indigenous law and a provincial law, maybe perhaps covering the same sort of areas of jurisdiction? Has the principle not been established that Indigenous law will prevail in that case?
I can't think of a court case that actually decides that. I mean, I've argued that in my written work, and that's just based on Section 35, because for me, Indigenous law is part of treaty and Aboriginal rights, and therefore it should take precedence over provincial or even federal law, except if there can be a justifiable infringement. But that's an exception. And in fact, courts talk about justifiable infringement, but the Crown is very seldom able to prove justification. In practice, it's not as big a threat as it appears in theory. That's right, but that was done through federal legislation, right, rather than through court decisions. Right.
And of course, with Child and Family Services jurisdiction recognition, I think that principle has been established there, that where an Indigenous governing body has established law in Child and Family Services, that will take precedence over provincial laws.
That's right, but that was done through federal legislation,
Yeah.
right, rather than through court decisions.
Through the court cases, yeah.
Right.
So I think this is a really interesting conversation, and I'm going to take us in a little different direction just for a second. I work for McNeil, which is charged with supporting the implementation of the Anishinaabe Nation Governance Agreement, which was recognized in federal legislation under the ANGA Act. And I have a question for you, Kent, that may help me with my work. And there's a section in that act that says, in the event of any inconsistency or conflict between the agreement and the provisions of any act of parliament or of any regulation made under the act of parliament, the agreement prevails to the extent of the inconsistency or conflict. How strong do you think that section of the ANGA Act is in reinforcing or recognizing the Section 35 right?
So that's a federal statute, right? And so Parliament has said that the agreement will take precedence, and therefore it should take precedence over other federal laws, except, so this isn't a treaty, I assume, so it's not constitutionally protected by Section 35, which means Parliament could override that. So there could be an act of Parliament saying, notwithstanding what's in the agreement, because Parliament can't bind itself. So, but I think that would be pretty exceptional for that to happen, for Parliament to have said one thing on the one hand and then to go against it on the other, right? There'd have to be really exceptional circumstances. And politically, I think that would not look good.
So that's really interesting. We've touched on the political and sort of used this example of the ANGA, and I think that's really interesting and helpful. And Kent, you've been working with the Supreme Court of Canada and providing your insights on decisions on Indigenous land rights and other matters. And you've talked about the challenges the courts and judges still have with interpretation. I'm wondering, how has policy changed from 1982 to now in the recognition of these rights claims? And, do you feel like we're progressing in a good way, or are we still so far short of the goal?
Well, we're short of the goal, but I think a lot of progress has been made. And a lot of that is due to Section 35 of the 1982 Constitution. And the many court cases that have gone up to the Supreme Court that have affirmed Aboriginal and treaty rights, Aboriginal title to land in Delgamuukw, and then in the Silcotin Nation case in 2014. So Section 35, of course, recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal treaty rights, has been taken on by the courts and has been used by the courts to promote Indigenous rights. Now, sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? But in general, I think the Supreme Court has made significant progress. And that progress in the courts then pushes governments because they have to respect the law, right? They have to respect what the Supreme Court says, or even lower courts. And because of that, governments have been forced to change their policies. Of course, government lawyers often try to interpret the Supreme Court decisions as narrowly as possible to limit the rights. But the Supreme Court keeps affirming the rights in many areas. They have not yet affirmed the right of the inherent right to self-government. So the Supreme Court keeps avoiding that issue. And I think because they want to see that dealt with politically through negotiation, they're worried about setting the parameters of self-government, trying to work out jurisdiction conflicts between federal, provincial, and Indigenous laws and government authority and so on. So Supreme Court tends to avoid that issue. But on the other hand, Supreme Court decisions have pushed governments, Canada and provincial governments, to acknowledge to some extent self-government rights. So in 1995, the federal government said that it acknowledged the inherent right of self-government and would negotiate future land claims agreements to include self-government rights. And it's done that, right? Now, some people would say, yes, but they only recognize the rights once they've been negotiated and they're in agreements. And in the agreements, they're just too limited. They really don't acknowledge a full inherent right to self-government and so on. So I'm not saying that this is all good, but there has been progress. But as I said at the beginning, a lot still remains to be done. And, as Francis was saying earlier, a lot of this has to do with the continued existence of the Indian Act and the limitations that imposes on First Nations.
I was just wondering, as you were talking there, you talked about government having to keep up with the courts, both provincial and federal governments, I'm assuming. I'm wondering, do you feel like they've kept pace? And how even is that across the country? Or are there some provinces or jurisdictions that are leading, or is it relatively even?
No, it's not even. And I think it depends not only on the particular province, but also what political party happens to be in power at the time. So in BC, for example, before the NDP government came into power in the early 1990s, the BC provincial government continued to deny the existence of Aboriginal title to land. They said, well, even if it existed, as the Supreme Court said in the Calder case in 1973, it got extinguished, right? And they continued to take that. So NDP government got elected in the early 90s and changed the position on that. Therefore, the BC Treaty Commission got created and modern land claims agreements started to be negotiated in British Columbia. I think the province of New Brunswick is, because there are no land cession treaties there historically, the government there is, I think, pushing very hard against any kind of land claims. And there's a major claim in the courts right now involving about half of the province of New Brunswick. The more conservative the government, the less open they are. That's a real generalization, but I think that tends to be the case.
Well, thank you for those insights. Francis, I want to ask you, in the article, How Indigenous Nations Have Been Transforming Public Policy Through the Courts, it says, in regard to sections 25, 35, and 37 in the Constitution Act 1982, there was the greatest ever mobilization of a Canada-wide Indigenous lobby. What are some other notable moments First Nations have successfully brought and changed policy in Canada's courts?
Well, that's a big question. There are lots of examples of successful initiatives. So the one I think everybody knows about is the national mobilization when the federal government of Pierre Trudeau, introduced the white paper, the so-called white paper, which was an assimilationist document that went in the face of advice the government had received just a few years before when they spoke to the Hawthorne Task Force. So the white paper galvanized a lot of organization and mobilization. It was also part of a movement that found its way to the courts. And so early in the 70s, we had what we all call the Calder case, which was Nashkawa going to the court in British Columbia, the Paulette case in the Northwest Territories, which Dene used to put an injunction on possible pipeline construction in the Mackenzie Valley. They held the land, put an injunction out. And then the last one was the Maloof decision, we call it, in Quebec, which Cree in northern Quebec gained by resisting the Bay James hydro development. So in that period of our history, you see the people's mobilization across the country finding an expression in part in court cases. There was lots else going on, but that was the Constitutional Express, demonstrations, all sorts of other action, delegations to speak to the Crown in England, many things. But an important aspect of it was those 3 court decisions, which forced, in the case of Calder, began to change the mind of the federal government about the existence of Aboriginal rights and the need to negotiate. The Paulette decision, which did put an injunction on the lands that the pipeline would have gone through, and the Maloof decision, which forced Hydro-Quebec and the province to the table with the Cree. So that was a political use of the courts that backed by political mobilization that were very, very important in changing Indigenous-Canada relations, I would say forever. That's just one example.
Does academic work or research play in supporting these legal and policy efforts, would you say?
Well, I'd say that Kent's legal work has been very important. He and a handful of other scholars have developed the case, so to speak, and the Indigenous lawyers and those who work with Indigenous lawyers are still working on that, on making that case. But that work has been very important in providing a means for the Supreme Court to understand what the new world could look like. And they've provided the material for some of those decisions that are so important. For other work, well, the kind of work that Catherine and I do has to do with the practical side of implementing Section 35 government outside the Indian Act. There are many, many things to figure out there, including the financial side of it. So that's a good thing for academics to do, is to work on how that could work, what it could be like, and how it could work. Not in a prescriptive way, but just in a look at the options way. Here are some possibilities. A third thing that academics from all disciplines could do is think about documenting and acknowledging the changes that are underway. I think it works something like this. Academic research gets published. A handful of people read it in the journals, but it seeps out into popular media, onto websites, into the consciousness of students, and it can begin to change the way in which these issues are considered. It can open up, if pardon the expression, but it can open up the paradigm so that we have new ways of thinking about the Indigenous-Canada relationship. And that's a process that's hard to prove, but at this end of my long life, I could say I've seen it in action, that once people understand what's been going on, they are in a position to be able to change their mind about what's possible. And academic work can play a role in that.
Frances, just wondering, as you say in your long life of academic work, if you could reflect on whether there's enough academic work going on in this field these days, or have you seen sort of highs and lows over time? My own personal feeling is that there is not enough, looking at, from a public policy or public admin point of view, looking at the practical realities of Indigenous governance, but I'd welcome your reflections on that. Sorry, Dwayne, muscling in.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's, there's been, in the area of Indigenous studies or work by Indigenous scholars, there's been a development of a whole new field, which is thinking through research methodology, or how do we deal with different approaches to knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and, pardon the expression, mainstream knowledge. That sort of work is going on. But it remains, in my opinion, it remains too abstract to be all that useful when it comes to thinking through what the future of self-determination can be. And there's a lot of practical work that needs to be done in thinking through what could actually work. As I believe that there is a sentiment in the country that we need to do things differently, that I'm speaking now as a non-Indigenous person. I think a lot of people agree with that. We have to figure out a new way to coexist, the Indigenous societies and the rest of the society. And although there's the will, we don't quite have the way. We haven't figured out the way yet. And it has to do with things like provinces. The provincial governments control Crown land. The land that nobody else owns belongs to the Crown, that's our legal starting point. So the provinces have to be able to reconceive how they're going to manage Crown land in order to make the reforms for the future possible. That's not work that, to my knowledge, is hardly anyone working on that very big question. And there are a lot of issues like that are great topics for people to undertake, great things for people who are now doing graduate degrees to start thinking about. I would recommend it.
So I would just put this one question out to any of you. You've all been researching and studying and these issues for many, many years. And I'm wondering if you've noticed any patterns or factors tend to lead to some success in policy transformation. You've talked about some gaps in research, but I'm wondering if you've noticed anything else that, certain conditions or circumstances or factors that have actually advanced change.
Well, one thing that's helped a lot is the increase in the numbers of Indigenous young people who are choosing to go to university, because very often they bring the life experience that has been lacking in the university system, but they also bring the motivation to work on these issues. And in my time at university, that's been one of the most inspiring and powerful processes, is to see Indigenous scholars come into the academy, do their graduate work, get academic jobs, and then teach. So that's a really, really important change.
And I can say from, where I'm working at McNeil, I work with a team of 5 policy analysts, and 3 of them are young people who've come out of university programs that didn't exist when I went to university. And now they are very enthusiastic champions of change. They're grinding away, working with First Nations directly to write laws and figure out systems of implementation and wrestle with challenges like moving from a membership-based system under the Indian Act to being recognized as citizens under their own constitutions. And so I can say not only in the academic world, but these people are getting out there into the nations now too. And I think that's so exciting. It's such a dearth for so long of analytical capacity in our nations. You got program funding and you were told how to spend it and don't think about it too much. And that whole world is changing. And so it's a credit to all of you who've pioneered a lot of this research and how we're moving that forward on a practical level. So miigwech for that.
And as you know, as part of the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, we have the youth wing, the Indigenous Rights Youth Initiative, and that's brought together idealistic young people from across the country to learn about the theory and the practice of Section 35 government. And they are inspiring. They're committed, they're hardworking, they're well-trained, and they're fun to work with. So I agree with you. That's a really, the rising of the youth that we're privileged to be part of, that's really an important change.
Catherine, you've got an article coming, and in that article you say that First Nations need to review their existing policies, understand their legal authority, and realign policy to reflect their own cultures, values, and priorities. I'm wondering if you can explain what those policies might look like, and how does creating policy that reflects culture help First Nations break through some of the obstacles and dead ends we've been talking about within the Indian Act?
Yeah, so maybe just for other people, a bit of context to this, that this is a paper based on some work that Satsan asked me to do. Ultimately, I've done 3 communities now. Started with one back in 2017, where sort of as part of helping the Center for First Nations Governance, helping communities to start charting a path forward for themselves to get out from under the Indian Act, to become self-governing, where could they start? And one of the places is kind of mastering the Indian Act, understanding what their current governing authorities are, where they came from, do they reflect themselves in any way, and then where do they want to go from there, kind of thing. So we had just started out initially as helping communities do a review of all of the policy type documents that they had created or had on their books over the years. And that was everything from bylaws to governance and admin policies, in some cases a couple of laws, or sort of other kind of policy declarations that the nation had made. So when we looked at those, we realized that probably leadership in particular, and the community especially, had not really sat down ever to kind of look at what was driving their decision-making in the community, and how was it that people made certain decisions, whether it was around health services or whatever, which often led to a lot of frustration, a lot of sometimes outright animosity in the community. And as we worked through them and they started having a look at all of these documents that they had, people realized that that was an important place to start, and particularly that in their histories, before colonization, they had been policy makers always, and policies are about how we live together and what kind of decisions we're going to make in what way and for what reasons are reflected in protocols and teachings and traditional law that's carried through the language and so on and so forth. And so, what was the relationship of that to these modern day documents that they were using? And we really kind of focused on sort of the governance and admin because it was an easy, fairly straightforward place to start, and to start thinking about, okay, where do these policies come from? Whose direction do they represent? Do they serve us at all as a nation? Are we getting results we want in this area? Do they support our priorities? Are people actually using the policy? In many cases, lots of organizations go through this. People forgotten they even had policies on certain things to begin with. So it was like starting to wrap their heads around this stuff. Then they could really ask themselves the questions, well, if this is not working for us, what would? And what would better reflect our priorities as a community? who do we need to engage in providing better options for some of these areas of work. It was a fairly simple, straightforward, and accessible way for leadership and council members and even senior staff to sit down together and say, okay, these personnel policies really do not reflect our culture. They're punitive, they're mean, they're confusing, nobody knows what their responsibilities are, it's not focused on serving the people. Let's revise that. And it's a fairly simple and straightforward way for people to begin to approach and begin to assert their own wants and needs and directions and culture in their day-to-day living and working.
And so I'm wondering, this is really interesting about how you've explored these governance and administrative areas. And I'm wondering if there's a specific example you could share about where this kind of cultural realignment was starting to take place.
It was one of the things that we identified was that there was actually very little cultural match between the values and the principles of that nation and policy documents. The best example I saw actually was community safety plan or strategy, that it actually incorporated 4 key teachings, not only into the preamble, which we see a lot happen in lawmaking in First Nations and even in some policies where people will embed some traditional principles expressed through their own language in the preamble of a document. So that's relatively common. But in this case, we actually saw them sort through not just the structure of the document, but actually the very specific activities that they would undertake around community safety and security according to these 4 very core principles of their traditional laws. So that was really exciting to see. I've seen there's governance principles expressed in very different pictographs. In Western thought, it's, you start at the top and it's very hierarchical and one thing drives another all the way down. Their principles for how they would live to work together. It wasn't a full-blown constitution, but it was, kind of a pre-constitutional kind of document, was actually depicted as a beaded flower. And they were able to demonstrate and talk about how sort of every element of this pictogram reflected the values of that community. So you're starting to see people experiment, play with taking very different approaches. And certainly, as you sit down, and even if you're going to write it in English in a standard policy document, still just asking people to think through the issues that the policy is meant to address from their cultural lens and their own values and their own priorities, you start to get very different words on a page and very different ideas about how to deal with issues in a community and how to implement them. So there's value, no matter how you go at it.
And so I know we're starting to get a little short on time, but I would put this thought I have out to any of you, and that is we have these very dynamic circumstances in First Nations that are advancing their own internal governance and these administrative changes. And I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on how these nations can balance the community legitimacy of these policies with perhaps having them integrate or be compliant with laws that are external to the community. We're not self-governing in every area. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that, on how First Nations can maybe navigate or manage this very dynamic set of circumstances we find ourselves in.
Maybe I could jump in on that to start. The issue here is sort of which laws apply in which different contexts, right? Whether it's First Nation laws, and I'm not talking about the Indian Act and Band Council bylaws and so on. I'm talking about exercise of the inherent right of self-government, and how does one resolve conflict between those laws and provincial laws and federal laws. So I said earlier that, in my opinion, Indigenous law should take precedence due to Section 35 of the 1982 Constitution, unless the province or the feds can prove justifiable infringement, which I think would be very difficult in the exercise of Indigenous law. That I don't think that's going to happen, or very rarely. But there's an issue of to what extent First Nations feel that they are ready to take on expanded jurisdiction. So there are issues of readiness in the community, having the resources and the people to do these things, having the financial resources. These are things that I know Catherine and Francis work more on than I do. But these are some of the practical challenges that people have. So I work mainly on the theory, saying, yes, you have an inherent right to self-government. You can exercise it. But even there will often be situations where the exercise of the inherent right of self-government will get challenged. It can get challenged by provincial government, federal government, or also by individuals within or outside the community. So there are all kinds of complicated issues here. So in modern land claims agreements, which set out self-government powers of the First Nations who enter into them, these kind of issues are addressed, which laws are paramount in which situations and so on. But I said earlier, a lot of First Nations people aren't happy with the extent of the self-government powers that are recognized and acknowledged in these modern land claims agreements. Often provincial laws will be paramount, or provincial standards have to be met even when Indigenous peoples are making their own laws and so on. It's a very complicated process, but I'd like to hear what Francis and Catherine have to say about it too, because they're more in the area of implementation.
I would make 2 points about that. One is it doesn't have to all happen at once. And one of the things that we've learned doing the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project is that many nations have decided to just work on one area of governance, of self-government, and get that on the new system, sort of in the new way, before they move on to another one. So it can seem daunting to just leap off the cliff into the new form of government, and maybe there'll be some nations who choose to do that and then figure it out from there. But there's always the option of just working area by area. And I know that's something that the people Dwayne used to work with have done. So taking over areas of jurisdiction and setting them up. The second thing is it's working on the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. It's clear to me that there's a lot to be gained by learning from other nations. People talk about peer-to-peer learning, but in this area, nations can learn from the examples set by other nations. They can learn from the experience of others, and nobody has to reinvent the wheel every time. So that's also a way to find examples of how to advance without having to take on everything all at once.
I think to sort of bolster both the points from Kent and Francis, one of the things that I looked at by focusing on governance and administrative policy with First Nation or Band Office is that those are very manageable. Francis is right. You don't have to do everything all at once. And Kent says it can be complicated and daunting to be making sort of big legislative change from the beginning. Focusing on something like your own internal governance and administration policy is a way to start slowly building those capacity and confidence in your ability as a government, as a lawmaking government, to be able to address issues and setting direction through the development of policy. And I've seen examples where once people started doing it and saw the power in doing that it just builds the confidence and the capacity to the next one and the next one and to do more complicated things. But the second thing that none of us have touched on, and I think is vitally important in any of this work, is engaging the people in your community around these issues. I mean, fundamentally, the inherent right is a collective right, and they are the rights holders. At a minimum, your legitimacy as a First Nations government is going to rest on the people's faith in you and trust in you and the legitimacy that you carry according to them. And so when you set out to do policy and lawmaking, the most successful policies and laws are those that capture hearts and minds, that people feel are legitimate, that reflect what's important to them and that they're willing to comply with. And so whatever you do, whatever you choose to focus on, whether it's a big legislative change or smaller changes within the way you do business in the band office. And we know that in many communities there, again, because of the terrible impacts of the Indian Act, there are issues of trust that have to be dealt with, and you're not going to gain that trust by just somehow magically coming up with something for everybody to ratify in a vote next week. You really need to, part of bringing people along Their involvement and role in nation rebuilding will mean you will be so much stronger for it, including, I would argue, in front of Canadian courts.
Well, I think that is a really fitting way to finish up our conversation today. Self-government begins and ends with the people, and they have to be involved at every element of the process. I want to thank all of you for your very thoughtful contributions to this discussion today. I always find it to be such a privilege and honor to chat with all of you. It's been really rewarding for me to be a part of the Rebuilding First Nation Governance work and to learn from all of you. It's just been, in my language, you say, "Chinendam." It makes me really happy. Miigwech for joining us in this conversation today. Miya, as they say. That's it.
Masicho.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for listening, everyone. Goodbye for now.
Miigwech gi bijayak mompinongam. Thank you to Catherine MacQuarrie, Kent McNeil, and Francis Abele for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. We hope you join us next time on Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, reclaiming our rights and ourselves. Next episode, get ready for an in-depth conversation on Bill C-92, where host Nathan Oakes will guide us through the governing structures in First Nations children and family laws.